The rain poured relentlessly over the streets of Portland, casting a somber mood that matched Ethan Carter's thoughts. He clutched his worn backpack tighter, the weight of his textbooks and responsibilities pressing down on him. At 25, Ethan was exhausted, his days filled with law classes, late night shifts at a coffee shop, and an endless battle against the mountain of debts his late father had left behind. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar. He hesitated but answered. Ethan Carter speaking. A composed, authoritative voice greeted him. Good evening, Mr. Carter. My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I'd like to discuss a solution to your financial troubles. Can you meet me at Whitmore's Bistro at 7 p.m.? Wait, Ethan said, his brow furrowing. How do you know about my financial situation? Who are you? I'll explain everything when we meet. Be there. The call ended before he could respond. Ethan stared at his phone, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. Still, curiosity and desperation got the better of him. At precisely 7 p.m., he pushed open the doors of the upscale bistro. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped him, a stark contrast to the rain-soaked chill outside. Sitting at a corner table was a striking woman. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, and her tailored navy suit radiated sophistication. She exuded the kind of confidence that made people stop and stare. Ethan approached cautiously. Miss Whitmore? He asked. Mr. Carter, she said, gesturing for him to sit. Thank you for coming. Ethan slid into the chair opposite her, his unease growing. You said you wanted to talk about my finances? Charlotte took a sip of her tea, her piercing blue eyes studying him. I'm aware of the debts you inherited from your father. I also know about your mother's medical bills and your younger sister's tuition. You're barely keeping your head above water. Ethan's jaw tightened. How do you know all that? I have my ways, she replied coolly. I didn't invite you here to discuss how I know. I invited you to offer a solution. A solution? Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms. Unless you're handing me a check, I don't see how. Marry me, Charlotte interrupted, her voice calm yet firm. Ethan froze, sure he'd misheard her. Excuse me? You heard me, Charlotte said, setting her cup down. This isn't about love. It's a business arrangement. I pay off your debts and secure your family's financial future. In return, you become my husband. Ethan blinked, stunned. Why would you want that? You don't even know me. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Ethan. I need a companion, someone to share my name, nothing more. Think of it as a contract. A contract. Ethan's voice rose with incredulity. This is insane. What's in it for you? Her expression softened, though only slightly. I've spent my life alone. No children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances, and I want control over my legacy. A husband solidifies that. Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. You expect me to just agree to this? To give up my life for money? Not give up your life, Charlotte corrected. Save it. Ethan pushed back his chair, the sound scraping loudly against the floor. I can't. I need time to think. Of course, Charlotte said smoothly, but don't take too long. My offer doesn't stand forever. The walk home was a blur for Ethan. The rain soaked through his jacket, but he barely felt it. Charlotte's words echoed in his mind, clashing with his pride and the crushing reality of his situation. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, her face pale from weeks of illness. After explaining Charlotte's proposition, he waited for his mother's reaction. It sounds unthinkable, she admitted, her voice trembling. But Ethan, maybe it's worth considering. If she's willing to help, perhaps this is the answer. Ethan's hands tightened into fists. You're asking me to marry someone I don't love? To sell myself for money? I'm asking you to save yourself, she said, her eyes filled with tears. To save us. Ethan couldn't respond. As the rain continued to fall outside, he sat in silence, torn between pride and desperation, knowing that whatever choice he made would change his life forever. A week later, Ethan Carter stood in front of a small courthouse, his suit clinging uncomfortably to his shoulders. The rain had returned, a constant companion to his newfound uncertainty. He glanced at his reflection in a puddle by his feet and barely recognized the man staring back. Was this the face of a hero saving his family, or a man selling his soul? The ceremony was brief, almost clinical. No flowers, no guests, just Charlotte Whitmore's lawyer, a notary, and the judge officiating the vows. Charlotte, clad in an elegant cream suit, looked every bit the part of a woman who always got what she wanted. Her calm demeanor unnerved Ethan more than anything. "Do you, Ethan Carter, take Charlotte Whitmore?" The judge's voice droned on, but Ethan barely heard the words. His gaze flickered to Charlotte, who offered him a faint, knowing smile. "I do," he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. As they exited the courthouse, Charlotte's umbrella shielded them both from the rain. She turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Carter." Ethan followed her into a waiting black sedan, his chest tightening as the car rolled through the city. Each mile carried him farther away from his old life and closer to the unknown. When they reached her estate, the gates creaked open, revealing a mansion so grand it felt like stepping into another world. The sprawling structure loomed against the gray sky, its columns pristine, its windows dark and unwelcoming. "Come," Charlotte instructed, her tone brisk. "You'll have plenty of time to acclimate." Inside, the grandeur of the mansion was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and gilded mirrors adorned every room. A housekeeper approached, her movements quiet and precise. "Show Mr. Carter to his room," Charlotte said without a glance back. Ethan followed the housekeeper up a winding staircase. His room was opulent, a king-sized bed with silk sheets, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. Yet, for all its luxury, the room felt cold and devoid of life. "Dinner is at 7," the housekeeper informed him before disappearing. At precisely 7, Ethan made his way to the dining room. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, but only two places were set, one at each end. Charlotte sat at the far end, dressed in a sleek black dress with a strand of pearls around her neck. She gestured for Ethan to sit. "You'll adjust quickly," she said as a chef entered, setting down plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables. "The estate is large, but you'll learn your way around." "Is that what happened to your late husband?" Ethan asked, unable to mask the edge in his voice. Charlotte paused, her knife hovering over the steak. She dabbed her lips with a napkin before speaking. "Harold was a businessman, much like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice." "What happened to him?" Ethan pressed. Charlotte's gaze turned icy. "Let's just say Harold's story didn't have a happy ending, but that's in the past." "Is it?" Ethan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Charlotte smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed no warmth. "You'll soon understand, Ethan. Everything I do is with purpose." The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Afterward, Ethan wandered the halls of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The estate was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He passed several locked doors, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. Each one seemed to hold secrets he wasn't meant to uncover. When he finally returned to his room, exhaustion should have pulled him into sleep, but his mind refused to rest. Charlotte's words replayed in his head, each one raising more questions than it answered. What had he truly agreed to? And what was Charlotte hiding behind her polished exterior? As the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his chest heavy with unease. For the first time, he realized the full weight of his decision. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a game, a dangerous one, and he wasn't sure if he was playing to win or merely survive. Ethan Carter's days at the Whitmore estate began to blur together, each one as cold and sterile as the mansion itself. Charlotte remained as composed as ever, her routine rigid and deliberate. Ethan, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the staff, by Charlotte, by the very walls of the house. One evening, while exploring the sprawling library, Ethan noticed Charlotte's desk. It was meticulously organized, every paper perfectly aligned. Yet one thing caught his eye, a small, ornate key glinting under the light of the desk lamp. He hesitated, his gaze darting toward the doorway. The house was silent. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the key and slipped it into his pocket. The key felt heavier than it should have as he climbed the stairs to the second floor. The locked doors he had passed earlier came to mind, each one a potential gateway to answers he desperately needed. He stopped at one door near the end of the hall. Its brass handle was cool to the touch, and when he inserted the key, it turned with a soft click. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. The room was like a time capsule, frozen in an era long gone. Faded wallpaper and dusty furniture surrounded him. But what drew his attention was a desk piled with papers. Ethan approached cautiously, his fingers brushing over the brittle edges of the documents. He froze when he saw the first name on a letter, Harold Whitmore. His heart pounded as he scanned the contents, the words sharp and condemning. Your father ruined everything. His deceit destroyed my family, and my husband paid the ultimate price. You will carry his sins, Ethan Carter. Just as he left us with nothing, I will take everything from you. Ethan's hands trembled as he dropped the letter. The words were Charlotte's, written in a script so precise it felt like a knife. Beneath the letter were legal documents detailing failed business deals between his father and Harold Whitmore. Contracts, lawsuits, evidence of a fraud that had left the Whitmores bankrupt. And then, among the stack, a marriage license caught his eye. His name was on it. The date startled him. It was filed weeks before their wedding, far earlier than he had known. Find what you were looking for. Charlotte's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Ethan spun around, the papers slipping from his hands. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hall. Charlotte, I can't explain, he stammered. Her lips curled into a cold smile. Don't bother. You're not the first to underestimate me, Ethan. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing. His chest tightened as he stepped forward. Why did you marry me? Was it ever about helping my family, or was this all about revenge? Charlotte's eyes narrowed, her calm composure cracking just slightly. You think I owe you an explanation? Your father destroyed my family. Harold died because of the stress your father's lies caused. This marriage? It's justice. Ethan's fists clenched, anger rising in his throat. Justice? You're punishing me for something I had no part in. I didn't even know about my father's dealings until after he died. And yet here you are. Charlotte snapped, her voice sharp and venomous. A Carter, just like him, living comfortably while others paid the price for your family's greed. This isn't justice, Ethan shot back. This is manipulation. You're no better than the man you despise. Charlotte's expression darkened, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Careful, Ethan. You may think you're in control, but you're not. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone in the suffocating room. The silence pressed in around him, and for the first time, the walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The key felt like a lead weight in his pocket, a constant reminder of the Pandora's box he had opened. The truth about Charlotte's motives was clear now, but it only left him with more questions. What else was she hiding? And more importantly, how could he escape the web she had so carefully spun around him? Determined to find answers, Ethan resolved to fight back. Charlotte might have orchestrated this marriage, but he wasn't going to let her dictate his future. For the first time, he felt a spark of defiance, a determination to outmaneuver the woman who had underestimated him. But as he stared at the shadows dancing on his bedroom ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Ethan's room, but its warmth did little to thaw the tension that had settled over him. He stood by the window, staring out at the pristine gardens that now felt more like a gilded cage. His mind raced with the revelations from the previous night, the damning documents, Charlotte's calculated vendetta, and the crushing weight of his father's sins. A knock at the door startled him. "Mr. Carter," said the estate's butler, Mr. Harris, his calm demeanor betraying no emotion. "Mrs. Whitmore requests your presence in the sitting room." Ethan nodded, steeling himself. Charlotte didn't summon him unless she had something significant to say. As he descended the grand staircase, his footsteps echoed through the cavernous mansion. When he entered the sitting room, Charlotte was already there, seated gracefully in a high-backed chair. A glass of red wine rested on the table beside her, even though it was barely past noon. "Ethan," she said smoothly, gesturing for him to sit. "You've been restless these past few days." "Restless?" Ethan replied, his voice laced with defiance. "I'd call it something else, like trapped." Charlotte arched an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Trapped? That's an interesting choice of words for someone who agreed to this arrangement willingly." "I didn't agree to be lied to," Ethan shot back. "You didn't tell me the truth about my father or your intentions." This isn't a marriage, it's a sentence. Charlotte leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto his. And what would you have done if I'd been honest? Walked away? You needed me as much as I needed you, Ethan. Let's not pretend otherwise. You don't need me, he countered. You needed a pawn, someone to use for your twisted revenge. Charlotte's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Twisted? You have no idea what your father's betrayal cost me. My husband died because of him. Do you know what it's like to watch everything you've built crumble because of someone else's greed? Ethan's fists clenched. And you think destroying me will bring him back? You're no better than my father if this is how you choose to settle the score. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. Finally, Charlotte leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. You're more like your father than you realize. Defiant, stubborn, always thinking you're the hero. I'm nothing like him, Ethan snapped. We'll see, she said cryptically, taking a slow sip of her wine. But if you're planning something, I suggest you tread carefully. I've dealt with far more cunning adversaries than you. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, Charlotte. He left the room without another word, his mind racing. It was time to act. He couldn't let her control him any longer. That evening, Ethan met his old law school friend Jacob at a quiet diner in the city. He slid a folder across the table, the weight of its contents heavier than it should have been. This is everything I've found, Ethan said in a low voice. Documents, letters, even some of her current business dealings. She's not just targeting me, she's rebuilding her empire using illegal methods. Jacob flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. Ethan, this is serious. If we take this to the authorities, she'll go down, but you need to be sure. She's powerful and doesn't seem like the type to go quietly. I don't care, Ethan replied firmly. I'm done playing her game. The next morning, Ethan waited in the grand sitting room, the folder of evidence securely in his bag. When Charlotte entered, her usual icy composure was intact, but there was an edge to her gaze. You wanted to see me? She asked, her tone clipped. Ethan stood, holding her gaze. I know everything about my father, about Harold, and about the illegal deals you've made to rebuild your fortune. For the first time, Charlotte's calm facade faltered. Her eyes flicked to the bag in Ethan's hand. You've been snooping again. Do you even understand what your father did to my family? I understand that he wronged you, Ethan replied, his voice steady. But that doesn't justify what you've done. Hurting innocent people won't fix the past. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Innocent? You think you're innocent in all this? You carry his name, his legacy. That's enough. Ethan stepped closer, his voice rising. Revenge won't bring Harold back. It won't undo what happened. All you're doing is spreading the pain. For a moment, Charlotte said nothing, her expression unrateable. Then she took a step back, her lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. You think you've won, don't you? I don't care about winning, Ethan said. I care about doing what's right. At that moment, the sound of car doors slamming outside broke the tension. Ethan turned as two officers entered the room. Charlotte Whitmore, one of them said, stepping forward. You're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy. Charlotte's gaze never left Ethan's as they cuffed her. You may think this is over, she said quietly. But revenge has a way of lingering. Be careful it doesn't consume you, Ethan. As they led her away, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The fight was over, but the scars of it remained. For the first time, he was free, but freedom came at a cost.